Hi, I'm Veronica Tash. I'm currently seeking a PhD in political theory at Wayne State University here in Detroit, Michigan. I'm working 9 to 5 job on top of going to grad school, so I'm hoping to simplify that a bit through this. We'll see if that works. This series right here, not the entire channel, but this series is designed to be covering the theme of giving a deeper look at the ideas covered in AP government classes or the freshman college equivalent American government classes. Giving a philosophical background to the issues covered. The idea for the series came from giving the same essential preparation to my nibbling, that's the gender neutral version of niece or nephew, as they prepare to take AP government classes themselves. You may find yourself learning something a bit deeper even if you are past this level, and you may be interested even if you never went past the high school level, because this is a fundamental part of social living here in America or in various other countries, is understanding the political process, because the political process does affect your actual day-to-day life in numerous ways, even if you try to make it not affect it. It is something that you really ultimately need to understand to be able to navigate in the world and try to create a better life for yourself. The format here is going to be similar to a lecture, or rather a series of lectures, covering one topic at a time, where many will naturally feed into the next. While I may be able to answer a handful of questions on the comments, as time goes on, I may have less and less ability to respond to all the comments. I'm also unable to test you, grade you, etc. So this is meant to be a supplement to, not a replacement for, an actual class. However, I am going to be dropping questions for you to ponder or discuss with others at the end of the lecture, which can help you grasp the concepts by actually using them. And this is a great reason that if you enjoy what you're seeing here and you do want to discuss this, have your friends, have your family members watch as well. That way you can discuss it with them. I will even give you an optional paper assignment at the end of the series if you want some practice grappling with the subject matter. I'm not going to actually read your paper, but you may gain something out of the process of writing the paper. Helps you put ideas together, to do some focused research. It is something that you can get some benefit out of, but it is ultimately for you. It's in the act of doing it itself. You have no obligation to do it, obviously. I have no leverage over you whatsoever. But the main goal here is to give you a firmer understanding of American government, the ideas behind it, how it works, and hopefully how can we improve it. I will create a list that will play each video in the series one after another so that you can follow through sequentially. The channel may host other series or even material that is more advocative rather than educational, but the series itself that you're looking at right here is purely educational. If you appreciate the content, give it a like, give it a share, subscribe to the channel. All those are going to help. Of course, giving it a like is going to make sure that it's going to let you know more likely when something new comes out. Now, I am going to leave a spot for YouTube ads in case this channel does get monetized. I'm expecting that eventually it will. I'm not going to have more than one little ad break every 45 minutes to an hour worth of content, which may help you get a little of a break from what you've been watching. But I think it's also a nice middle ground where I'm getting some sort of compensation for showing you ads, but I am not just flooding you with ad after ad after ad, like I see so many YouTube channels do. And at least that's what I'm going to be trying at first. We will find out what happens. But if you're one of the first viewers of this, you're not going to see any ads because I'm not monetized yet. And so what we are going to do is start with Athenian democracy, because this is where we want to go back to what is the basis, what is the inspiration of the American democratic experiment. And what inspired the founders was Athens and Rome. And it's not quite accurate to say that they're both democracies, but there are aspects that are much more extensive than monarchy in both of them. And so we are going to look at what the founders looked at. We are going to try to get an idea of what this idea of democracy is. Athens is the original democracy that we have record of in recorded history. It doesn't mean it was the first one ever. They probably had no idea of any other democracies that went out, but human societies go back really millions of years. Homo erectus evolved 3 million years ago, and obviously Athens was not going to be anything like whatever was going on with early Homo erectus. But there is a long history that is unrecorded. Democracy may have popped up many, many times, and I would even suggest it's probably the default state of society. The very first societies probably were democracies of some sort, however much less formal. But looking at our first known democracy, we are going from 675 to 650 before the Common Era. That's BCE. Same thing as BC, just not explicitly Christian. Sparta begins their oligarchic republic. They spend much of their time afterwards overthrowing the tyrants in other Greek cities successfully. And tyrants were essentially the monarchs in Greece at the time. Didn't have quite the negative connotation that we give it today. Instituting oligarchies in their place, winning them the title the Liberators of Hellas. And I also want to point out another thing about republic. It is not necessarily democratic. A republic, in its original sense, just means it's from res publica. It's actually Latin. It just simply means the public thing. So it is a public endeavor rather than seen as a private endeavor of one king who owns everything. It is not necessarily much more than that, however. 594 BCE, so we're looking at 75 years later approximately. We have Solon reforms the laws of Athens, including freeing of Athenians from serfdom. Those were the hectomores while they were enslaved as serfs. That's a form of slavery. And they were changed into thetes, which are landless free peasants, essentially. Solon was a tyrant. He was tyrant over Athens. And years of degrading soil had left poor Athenians bonded into debt by the rich, leading to the serf-like existence. It was seen as if poor Athenians were more worthy than enslaved foreigners when Solon did this. And to explain in a little bit more detail, you have basically just soil degradation because they had no crop rotation back then. They hadn't thought of the idea, and so the land gets worse bit by bit, giving lower and lower produce each year. in the harvest. And so what these Athenian hectomores did is they looked to larger landowners who had excess and said, hey, can I borrow some? And so they borrow it against future grain outputs. And their debt would slowly grow over the years, even over the generations, to the point where they owed more than 1 year's worth of produce. At that point, essentially, they were bonded as serfs in the Athenian system. That's when they became hectomores. And so they were stuck on the soil. They had to keep working it. They were not free to go. They had that debt that they had to pay, and there's big pillars saying, "Hey, this is owned by a debt. Until this debt's paid off, this land all the produce goes to such a person." Of course, you're looking at a lot of civil unrest because of this. So Solon tried to resolve that, and at the same time, he was also freeing up the bigger landowners to be able to produce what they wanted on it, because what they were producing under the serfdom laws is they're producing basic staple crops. But if you want to plant something like you want to plant dates or olives, something that takes a lot longer to grow and is much more profitable, they couldn't force the serfs to do that until this happened. They gave up the land. It belonged now to the larger landowner, and the larger landowner could do what it wanted with it. And also, another one of Solon's reforms is the boule. Boule. And so I may be horribly mispronouncing that since I don't speak Greek. Which was given limited judicial power to a panel of 50 members from each tribe. Though their selection or election is unknown, how exactly they came. It ended up playing a different role later after democracy was instituted. It also included the Council of 400, which was the ultimate governing body and consisted of members of the higher class elected for life. 561 BCE, we have the Pisistratiid dynasty that took over Athens in a popular tyranny. And one of the things that really stuck out when you have these tyrannies is that the average common person tended to prefer them over oligarchies. And a big part of this is it takes a lot less to satisfy just one person or one family with all their greed compared to numerous competing oligarchs and their families. So the average person actually did better under monarchy as compared to oligarchy. But that is because they were subservient in both cases. And so this lasts about 50 years, where the last Pisistratiid tyrant is overthrown by the oligarchs. And so the oligarchy is plagued with the Dies Phemos, which is an event where the oligarchs accuse the followers of other oligarchs of not being fully Athenian. They didn't have both an Athenian mother and an Athenian father. And so they have them stripped of their status and rights, casting them out of Athens. The practice is especially used by Isagoras, who is an enemy of Cleisthenes, and the balance of power is about to tilt towards Isagoras. And I think I pronounced his name differently in 2 different times, such is the way. The bull had some influence on opposing Isagoras' attempt to overthrow the constitution. Cleisthenes' solution, which was amenable to many oligarchs who fear the imbalance of power, is to empower the demos as a failsafe. And there is some discussion, some controversy over whether or not he intended to quite empower them as much as they were empowered. The various tribes, including the oligarchs, are broken up into 10 new ones, each one having one part by the sea, one part in the interior, and one part in the city. And so they're creating these brand new tribes. It breaks up old loyalties, old power dynamics, and creates new people who are more concerned about their identity as Athenians as opposed to I'm of this particular tribe. The tribes are administrative bodies, but they're recreated into something completely incidental, something that has no real meaning behind it. You send out to the oracle. I think they gave like 100 different choices of these are what the possible tribe names are. The oracle picked 10 of them. These are the new 10 tribe names of Athens. And they, sent 1 to 3, you end up with 30 different little groups. Each tribe in each of the, in the city, by the sea, in the interior. And so each now selects their own representatives to be generals. They rotate several political offices by lot, which means they're not elected, just, hey, it's your turn to be the person who handles taking care of the roads, or it's your turn to be the person who brings oranges to the meeting. Whatever this lower political office is. But the bigger proposals or the bigger positions are those general positions and other things like that. They're all elected. And they tend to be handled by larger, higher elite groups within the Athenian social ladder. These are your higher groups here. They're the ones who had the time to devote to such things because they had a bunch of slaves taking care of everything for them. They're also the people who tended to be able to have an education. And so they're able to read, write. They know of all the previous philosophers coming out of Athens, very likely from other Greek cities. They can do math, basic mathematics and all that. Those are the people from the higher classes, and that's how it worked out. Now, it has been suggested by scholars that he intended to have his council, which is similar to the Council of 400. I don't know if it was 600 or 500. He created a whole new council. And it's been suggested that he wanted them to have the highest power. This is the decision-making body of Athens. And it was meant to be oligarchs still. However, somehow it slipped, and he created this mechanism where the people could have this, immense power, and they took advantage of it in ways that he didn't expect. And so you have this Athenian constitution fundamentally altered, and it wasn't meant to be a democracy, but that's how it ended up being by giving them these extra powers without enough forethought. But like I said, that is a suggestion. It is not guaranteed exactly what was planned there. They essentially casually usurped the power. It created something called isonomia, which is legal equality between all the Athenians. If you were Athenian, you had legal equality. Classes still exist. Only 10 to 20% of the population actually votes at any given time, or has the power to actually vote at any given time. You leave out the women, you leave out the children, and a very significant portion that must be at least half of the population who just weren't considered Athenian, even under the new rules, because now you only had to have an Athenian father. You didn't have to have an Athenian mother to be considered Athenian under the new rules. So here comes 509 BCE, the very next year. Isagoras attacks Athens with the aid of the Spartans to restore the oligarchy, and they fail to overthrow the new demos. And so this really tells you a lot about the Spartans, who were not, when you hear the Spartans being written about, they are always very slow, very dull people. And it wasn't so much that they were focused at that point, apparently, on tyranny bad. They weren't there to liberate health. They just really liked oligarchies. So here's the oligarchy got overthrown by Cleisthenes and other oligarchs. So they're here to go reinstate the oligarchy, taking Isagoras in. So their Spartans are this great army, and they're famous. They're glorified in the movie 300 because they fought off the Persians. And they were definitely the best land force in Athens. At no point were they trying to defend democracy, as they often get credited for, because they liked oligarchy. And they were really some nasty people that I've even suggested culturally. They shed their humanity with how nasty they could be. A good example, because I'm going to go into another one later, but good example for right now. In the middle of the Peloponnesian War, they decided that they were going to go kill anybody who was neutral that they came across. So they're going and they see some merchants coming by. They would go kill the merchants, take all their stuff, because they were neutral in the conflict. And literally it comes down to someone saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't just kill all the neutral people and just focus on your enemies. And they just did that. It never even occurred to them, apparently, to not kill neutral parties. So they were extremely warlike and hostile and not very bright. And they were proud of not being very bright. They saw that as virtue and honor, that they were essentially idiots. It's not something genetic. They made themselves into idiots as part of their culture. So anyways, the Athenians are empowered by these new promises, and the rabble of Athens even take the field, and they fight off the Spartans with a contingent by Isagoras, and so Athenian democracy is saved past that first year. Now, as a note, I do want to note that before making this video, I came across a video by Ryan Chapman, which frames Cleisthenes as a popular dictator. Didn't match with what I had read. But I wrote it off until I heard the same video cited by Metatron, who has a fascination for classical Roman and Greek history. So I took a deeper look into it, figuring the academic papers I read on it could have been only a minority view, all the ones I read. It's very unlikely, but it's possible. It was extremely unlikely, just because I've read 10 different papers on how this happened. I looked it up for a class on Thucydides, where I was looking at trying to address the scope of the group within Thucydides, and to really understand that, I needed to look at how Athens came about, and you have this greater sense of group there. And so most of my knowledge came from that paper. I took it that it might be wrong, so I started actively looking for this information. It's nowhere to be found. You go look at academia, you look at common mainstream sources, it's not mentioned even as a controversy or a minor point. If you look at Wikipedia, which Wikipedia is an ideal source, but if you're trying to look for, is there some popular conception even, then you get bad information on Wikipedia that is a popular conception by all means. It's going to probably reflect the popular conception. It's not there. So I tried to go, figure out what was going on because I don't want to end up giving out bad information myself. For this point, Chapman cites Will Durant's 1939 book, The Life of Greece. It is old, but when an issue is settled in the field, old sources tend to be authoritative. You don't rehash the same fights over and over unless you have something meaningful to add to that debate. Things can get settled. They can be settled for hundreds, thousands of years. This is not something that, happened to be that way. Durant's work is not authoritative. Rather, it appears to be an attempt to create an account of Greek society, which was noted at the time to be lacking. There's not a good popular account of Greek society for the masses, and it was sloppily done. Durant was an academic, but seemingly a poor one. His scholarship was not accepted by the rest of academia at all. A 1940 review, because I went and started looking up for reviews of finding out more about Durant. A 1940 review of this particular book by M.S. Call, which was only 2 paragraphs long, and was essentially a glowing synopsis by someone who didn't specialize in the area and did around 10 other similar short reviews of other recent released books in the same article, that was positive. Then you can look at everything where you have the actual experts in the area. A 1940 review of the book by Charles Obermeyer stressed that Durant came to strange conclusions. It's just, no one thought that this was plausible. I'm not going to go into detail about that because the next one is just so juicy. It was actually kind of exciting to read, and this is usually very dry stuff, but this was had that with a scandal. You have a 1941 review by M.I. Finkelstein, and it made Obermeyer's dismissal seem glowing by comparison. He claims that Durant twists institutions to fit a modern framework and simply repeats his points of view over and over until they are believed, which is in actual effect seen in the real world. If you repeat a falsehood over and over, people begin to accept it. Sometimes we will get into 10, 20 lectures, something that we will get into 10, 20 lectures down the line. It's not something that we're going to be discussing right now. He notes that Durant shows a deep distrust for democratic forms and a contempt for the mob. He supports the view that an aristocrat with popular backing secures liberty better than democracy can. He made innumerable errors from uncareful reading. He takes the stance that equality is unnatural and concluded with, not a fair paraphrase, but this is a long quote from Finkelstein's review, an accurate portrayal of the material and intellectual forces of ancient Greek society in all the ramifications and interconnections can be more exciting than the cheap romanticization of Will Durant, and certainly more vital and socially useful. And that's an ouch. We'll move on to 1947. This is a few years later, about a decade later. It's not an immediate reaction. It does get covered in a 1947 article called The Apotheosis of Thucydides. And I might be mispronouncing that. Therscites. I'll just put it at the bottom in the text. which was written by Abraham Feldman, and he mocks Durant as making a reductio ad absurdum account of Thersites as a lower class advocate. For that short period, he was addressed by other academics, but he was dismissed by them at the same time. They're noting that, hey, this is a guy who has the credentials to speak on something like this, but he's ridiculous, and we're just going to note that he's there and that he is ridiculous. Nobody seems to take him seriously today, and Finkelstein's review seems to suggest that he was likely a Bolshevik who supported the lower class but opposed their ability to engage in self-rule, possibly to justify Bolshevik usurpation of the Russian Revolution at some point. Doesn't say that expressly at any point. I am just trying to read between the lines, get the inferences. That is what I got from it. You can feel free to look these up if you have access to it. All three are available on JSTOR. And if you don't have access to it normally, it is expensive. You're looking at like $100 a month to access like 30 articles, something like that. So you can do it, whether you want to or not. I can imagine most people probably don't want to spend that kind of money. If you are currently attending college, you should have access to it from your educational institution. So it seems that Chapman picked up an old book at probably an old used bookstore that looked interesting, read it, and was misinformed by it. It's a pitfall of being self-educated, and my understanding is that Mr. Chapman is self-educated on the matter. I couldn't find anywhere where he lists any sort of credentials himself. I've watched many of his videos, some which I like, others which I take issue with because of his politics, which are not those of Durant at all. I do not get the idea that Ryan Chapman is a Bolshevik trying to justify tyranny. So I don't think there's anything where he is intentionally doing anything here. I don't bring this up to deride him in any way, but only because others may have come across his video and it has 160,000 views. This video currently has 0. I definitely have under 1,000 on all what I have there on YouTube already. And so I want to make sure it's clear that Cleisthenes absolutely was not a popular dictator. This is a matter of settling the factual record. One of the biggest things about Athenian democracy that we have to look at is that they really never address class conflict. Once the demos gets the power, they really take it from a sense of we are one people. It really did successfully create the idea of one people. It did not include everyone in society. They had numerous other people who were not considered Athenian who lived in Athens, possibly even for generations. Athens was essentially an ethnostate. I'm not saying that's a good thing. Since this is an educational video, I will refrain from saying that it's a bad thing. But that is the essence of what Athens was. They saw themselves as a group of people descending from the first Athenians, at that point patrilineally, and that was who they were working for. And when they had power in Athens, you know what, we're going to get into deeper about how they really handled it later, so I'm going to hold off for a moment. In 480 BCE, Athenians go wild in the Persian War. It wasn't just the Spartans with their last stand in that mountain pass that held off the Persians. Athenians do something that is probably would be considered more dramatic, more heroic, And they really make a name for themselves within Hellas at this time because they literally abandoned their city. They grab everything up of um, you know that they can that has immense value. They stick it on their ships, and they sail away. They are a mobile fighting group um, against the Persians, and they don't. It's not just the men got up and left. No, the women, the children, the elderly, everybody came along, and Athens, was basically a nomadic camp for a year or two while they were fighting this war. Um, and so this really gives them renown, and even the Spartans agree in a meeting of the Hellenic League, which is alliance, sort of like a UN type of alliance of all the Hellenic states who are fighting against Persia. And this Hellenic League, doesn't really dissolve. I don't think it ever dissolves formally. I think it just sort of dissipates eventually over the years because of the Peloponnesian War. But I don't think the Hellenic League was ever formally disbanded. I could be wrong. I'm not. I'm going based off what I've read on this. I do not. I focus on political theory, not on ancient Greek history. There are many people who do focus on that, and by all means, they can correct me on that. But at the Hellenic League, they allowed them to form a navy among the various naval states by creating the Athenian League or the Delian League in 479. The Athenians used this alliance ultimately to extract resources from their allies. They invade many of them, they overthrow the oligarchies and put democracies in the place, which then in turn support them. Others they manipulate through bribery or intimidation. And so after everything is said and done, and there's a question, because by the rules of the Delian League, you're not allowed to attack another member state. Athens blatantly violated this. But they always made sure that by the time the next meeting rolled around, the people who are actively representing them, that particular city-state, they agreed, oh no, Athens didn't do anything wrong. They didn't violate the treaty, and everything is good. And of course, this is the beginning of Athenian imperialism, and that's something that I think that you probably have not heard before if you are in one of those two target areas there. You were not expecting that Athens is an imperial power and they have an empire, but that is the essence of Athenian democracy. They would often take the lands of conquered cities, so whether they're attacking an ally in the Delian League or not, you get these broad surrounding lands of the cities. And they would, you could grow farms, or you can have, Thucydides seems to have gotten a silver mine, or his family did at some point. And they, by lottery, they would give this to members of the two lowest classes. And this would essentially raise the social class of the people who won the lottery. Hey, you're a landless thief? Not anymore. Now you got this big ranch. Now you got this big mine. Whatever the case may be, that land was just given out to the people who are most in need of it. They also extracted what was probably like hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money from these cities, and they would use this in lieu of the other cities actually giving naval services. So it's, you give us the money, we're going to take care of everything here in Athens. We'll build the boats, we'll fight the battles. You can sit back. That was their method of handling it, and it made sure they always had the power and nobody acted up. But this was also a huge part of the Athenian sense of community. Because what was this money spent on? It wasn't spent on the rich. You would have some beautification projects, but the big thing about beautification projects is they employed these thetes, these poor landless peasants, who were considered Greek citizens and treated equally under the law. And I really should have mentioned earlier, when this first came about, they apparently had a big problem where the old oligarchs would shove free Athenian citizens out of the way, assuming they were slaves, because that's how poor they were. They were the same wealth level as actual slaves. And then they get into big trouble, legal trouble, because unlike the slaves, these poor Athenians had legal rights now under isonomia. But they funded these projects. They funded for war orphans, to make sure that if your parents died in battle, or one of your parents, you were taken care of. You have this extra money coming in to take care of you in that case. You were hiring all these poor thetes in order to be rowers for the Athenian Navy. It was a steady source of income, a living, and so it's not directly welfare, but they're worried about the social welfare of the least amongst them, and they were able to do this, and oligarchs couldn't do anything about it because they were outnumbered. They created the system. The system says that plurality wins, and they weren't very good at convincing them that it wasn't in their best interest. But one way or another, they never addressed the root inequality. They never addressed the inequality that existed between classes, where why am I doing labor for you and giving you the fruits of my labor, rather than having land redistributed so that I can be self-sufficient? That never came up. It wasn't part of how the Athenians thought about everything. They considered the oligarchs, hey, they're part of us too. And that was what really drove the imperialism, because you still had these poor people, they had to be taken care of. That was fueled by conquest and exploitation of other countries. That's just simply how Athens worked, and it's a great irony of world history. Now, it's also important, like I said, they had slaves in Athens. Slavery is not just a one-size-fits-all thing. The slavery that existed in Athens was nothing like, for example, chattel slavery in the American South. The slaves were able to actually have possessions. They were able to earn money. Slavery meant you were dominated. It did not mean that you were a full-fledged possession. You may be required to work for somebody for a set amount of time, but many of them bought their freedom and all sorts of things like that. And through most of the ancient world, you see nothing compared to chattel slavery in the South, with the only exception that I know of is the Spartans once again. And we really do need to focus on Spartan slavery for a moment. It was specifically of a group called the Helots. Now, what kind of slavery did the Helots see? They saw chattel slavery as well. And I would argue it is the one case that is more harsh than what we saw in the American South. Now, this was a group that was considered culturally different, but they also were a Hellenic group that were in the area that Sparta was beforehand. The ancient Spartans, the way that you became a man was that you had to sneak out of the barracks at night. not get caught, and you kill a helot in your sleep, or while everyone else is sleeping, and you sneak back. If you get caught, you get punished horribly. But if you make it back and you did it, congratulations, you're now a man. That's how the Spartans proved their manhood, by killing someone else. Um, they would often make, I don't know how they pulled it off, but they made the Helots fight side by with them in battle. Maybe there was a threat that they were going to kill everybody if they didn't behave themselves or something. Not the people on the battlefield, like everyone at home. But definitely there is a story during Thucydides where the Spartans decide they're going to go to the house and they're going to, hey, we are going to take 1,000 of you or some number of you. I don't know exactly the number. I don't care. Look up the exact passage right now. But we're going to reward you and give you your freedom, and you'll be free to go. So they picked them out. And they picked out the most rambunctious, the most soulful of the Helots. And they said, hey, you got your freedom. And they start marching them off away from the Helot camp. And once it's far enough away that the Helots can't hear or see anything, they take that group of Helots that they were saying they're going to free, they just killed them all. It was their way of preventing any sort of rebellion. We're just going to kill them all. And while you definitely see, the idea that you can kill your own slave in the American South, it wasn't done quite that wantonly. It was something that was still an exception, not the general rule where you just grab a large group of them and slaughter them genocidally, just to keep them in line. Especially without the others seeing. You weren't making an example of them. You were just, doing population control at that point. So I don't think it was a whole lot worse than American slavery, but I think it was just that little bit worse than American slavery, and is the unique example. There was nothing like that in Athens itself. But you did have people who were still lesser than, and they didn't have legal rights, and you could literally abuse them, and there was no recourse to the law, because the law did not protect them. It only protected Athenians. And so what we'll go to next, we are going to start talking about Thucydides. And Thucydides was a Greek general, an Athenian general specifically. He was, if you're familiar with Brave Sir Robin of Camelot, I would argue that Thucydides was the ancient example of Brave Sir Robin. You could definitely sing a song about him because he was exiled from Athens during the Peloponnesian War because he was there to engage a Spartan general in battle, and according to Thucydides, while the Spartans normally take forever to get anywhere, they're very indecisive and just slow moving. This particular Spartan general just shot right past them, the Athenians, and took the city before he could even react. The Athenian citizens, the demos, decided that Thucydides had taken a bribe and fled. And the only accounting that we really have of what happened is Thucydides' own account today, because he wrote a history of the period, which includes him talking in the third person about Thucydides and what happened. And I do not believe him. I think most scholars do believe him. I personally don't, and I think it's humorous if you do the brave Thucydides of Athens. When the Spartans turned their ugly head, Thucydides turned his tail and fled. I think that's a perfect fit. But I may be alone in that, and it might just be my sixth sense of humor. But we are going to cover that. After he got Exiled, he decided he's going to start writing. He's going to basically give his political theory about what should happen based on telling of the Peloponnesian War, but he did not tell it as a historian. It's often called a history, but it's not a history. It is a political treatise that he is carefully twisting things to fit a certain narrative that fits his events. And you don't really see much complaint. So it did closely match what happened, but you don't know which words are real. A lot of it's reconstructed, and it is constructed in such a way to tell a specific narrative that is Socratically leading you to a conclusion. But we're going to pull from a very specific part of it that, while word for word is highly unlikely to be accurate, the general tone of the words are probably there, because this is a speech by Pericles. Pericles is one of the Athenian generals, and he is essentially a king in everything but name. He doesn't act like a king, but what he says generally goes. He has that kind of influence and control over the demos that when he says, we ought to do this, they listen, they do it, they believe it's in their best interest. He is that good of an orator. So if Pericles doesn't actually say something similar to what's in here, there's no way the other Athenians aren't going to call foul, because he's saying this in public in Athens. They were there. They would be throwing a fit if it isn't close to what he said. So I do think this does give us a good idea, and what he's talking about is the greatness of Athens. There's actually two speeches. This first one is his funeral oration, where he talks about the virtues of Athens, how Athens is good, how Athens is great. He does tell one a few pages later where he is saying, hey, I've been sugarcoating everything all along. Yes, Athens is great, but you have to realize you're tyrants. And that's where he talks about the imperialism. We're not going to go into his speech about the imperialism. We're going to focus on what's in Thucydides. So I want you to go look at what we're going to be reading here. What we're going to be reading here is word for word from the landmark Thucydides, which is one of many translations. These translations all have the same basic narrative, but the exact words used to translate do not match very well. So you can listen to what I'm reading from here, which I prefer. There's another version that is open source, and you can get for free at perseus.tufts.edu, which hopefully I made appear at the bottom of your screen. Right there, you can look at this section of Thucydides, and you can read by and get the same basic ideas. I do not suggest you read it while I am reading out loud, because it is going to mess with your mind. But you can go back over it there, and you get the same basic thing. If you happen to have the same book as me, you can look at that same book. Of course, if you have a different translation, you can look at that different translation. But I'm going to go over his speech, give you word for word what it says, and then I'm going to have you stop, pause it, think about it, try to figure out what he is getting at. What are the themes? What do we get an idea of the Athenian democracy from this? And you can go back, play it over again, perfectly fine. The commercial break won't be till after this, so you don't have to worry about watching tons and tons of commercials. But after that, I'll go tell you what I saw, and then we'll have our commercial break. Okay, so we are going to look at Book 2, chapters 37 to 40, which are more paragraphs 37 to 40. But that is how you cite Thucydides, not by page number. So you can find that on Tufts, or you can listen here. Let me start reading. Our Constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Its administration favors the many instead of the few. This is why it is called a democracy. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private distances. If the social standing, advancement in public life falls to reputation for capacity, class considerations not being allowed to interfere with merit. Nor does poverty bar the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition. The freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. There, far from exercising a jealous surveillance over each other, we do not feel called upon to be angry with our neighbor for doing what he likes, or even to indulge in those injurious looks which cannot fail to be offensive, although they inflict no real harm. But all this ease in our private relations does not make us lawless citizens. Against this fear is our chief safeguard, teaching us to obey the magistrates and the laws, particularly such as regard the protection of the injured, whether they are actually on the statute book or belong to that code which, although unwritten, yet cannot be broken without acknowledged disgrace. Further, we provide plenty of means for the mind to refresh itself from business. We celebrate games and sacrifices all the year round, and the elegance of our private establishments forms a daily source of pleasure and helps to distract us from what causes us distress. While the magnitude of our city draws the produce of the world into our harbor, so that the Athenian fruits of other countries are as familiar a luxury as those of his own. If we turn to our military policy, there we also differ from our antagonists. We throw open our city to the world and never by alien acts exclude foreigners from any opportunity of learning or observing, although the eyes of an enemy may occasionally profit by our liberality. Trusting less in system and policy than to the native spirit of our citizens, while in education, where our rivals from their very cradles by painful discipline seek after manliness. At Athens we live exactly as we please, and yet we are just as ready to encounter every legitimate danger. In proof of this, it may be noticed that the Spartans do not invade our country alone, but bring with them all their confederates, while we Athenians advance unsupported into the territory of a neighbor, and fighting upon a foreign soil, usually vanquish with ease men who are defending their homes. Our united force was never yet encountered by any enemy, because we have at once to attend to our marine, and to dispatch our citizens by land upon 100 different services, so that wherever they engage with some such fraction of our strength, A success against detachment is magnified into a victory over the nation, and a defeat into a reverse suffered at the hands of our entire people. And yet, if with habits not of labor but of ease, and courage not of art but of nature, we are still willing to encounter danger, we have double the advantage of not suffering the hardships before we need to, and of facing them in the hour of need as fearlessly as those who are never free from them. Nor are these the only points in which our city is worthy of admiration. We cultivate refinement without extravagance and knowledge without effeminacy. Wealth we employ for more use than for show, and place the real disgrace of poverty not in owning to the fact, but in declining the struggle against it. Our public men have, besides politics, their private affairs to attend to, and our ordinary citizens, though occupied with the pursuits of industry, are still fair judges of public matters, for, unlike any other nation, we regard the citizen who takes no part in these duties not as unambitious, but as useless. And we are able to judge proposals even if we cannot originate them. Instead of looking on discussion as a stumbling block in the way of action, we think it an indispensable preliminary to any wise action at all. Again, in our enterprises, we present the singular spectacle of daring and deliberation, each carried to its highest point, and both united in the same persons, although with the rest of mankind, decision is the fruit of ignorance, hesitation of reflection. But the prize for courage will surely be awarded most justly to those who best know the difference between hardship and pleasure, and yet are never tempted to shrink from danger. In generosity, we are equally singular, acquiring our friends by conferring, not by receiving favors. Put the stress better. Acquiring our friends by conferring, not by receiving favors. Yet, of course, the doer of the favor is the firmer friend of the two. In order by continued kindness to keep the recipient in his debt, while the debtor feels less keenly from the very consciousness that the return he makes will be a payment, not for a free gift. And it is only the Athenians who, fearless of the consequences, confer their benefits not from calculations of expediency, but in the confidence of liberality. Now feel free to go read through that again. Feel free to go back to right before I started. But try to pick out what themes you think are important about Athenian democracy. And I'm not going to give you too much time in video time. You want to go back in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so here's what I noticed. First, it starts with its administration favors the many instead of the few. And what is really striking about this is completely different than how we define democracy. He says it's called democracy because of the administration's favor, not because of the people controlling it. And this is not an argument for the democratic centralist concept that that something is a democracy just if it works in favor of the people, if you have some elite administrating on behalf of the masses. Rather, it speaks more strictly to what these Greeks, so close to when it began, what stood out as a difference between democracy and other forms of government. Um, when you looked at oligarchy, when you looked at tyranny, or you call it monarchy or an aristocracy, whichever way you want to call it, they did not rule in the favor of the many. They worked on ruling in favor of the class interests of the monarch, or I'm ruling in the class interests of this super rich elite group of aristocrats or oligarchs. That is, where democracy stood out. That the actual policies that came forward for the first time, that in their knowledge, favored the people, the many, rather than just a small portion thereof. I also noticed the freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. This speaks to a social liberalism that is often missing in these early areas. We don't really see it pop up again until the Enlightenment, much later, and we even struggle with it today. There's many different things where you have a lot of people who dislike how certain people live, and without even trying to understand that, they look to stop them from living that way, even if there is no actual harm done to anyone. They will create the myth of harm. And for right now, I'll let you ponder on who I may be talking about. And it shouldn't be too hard to figure out, but some people may have to think on that a bit. We throw open our city to the world. They had complete transparency. This idea of national security that we often invoke here in America. You can think back to when Chelsea Manning had released all this documentation, videos of American citizens committing war crimes. It was not taken very friendly. She was thrown in prison, and then later on was thrown in prison again to try to coerce her into testifying against God, I can't remember the guy in charge of WikiLeaks. How do I not remember his name? Julian Assange. It was not looking at transparency. And these weren't even things that could actually be used by our enemies against us. This was just simply showing Americans committing war crimes. This is a shame. And for that alone, Chelsea Manning was in prison. That is not at all where the Athenians were. They let, if Sparta happened to be in the midst while they are planning a counterattack in the middle of the Peloponnesian War, where they're fighting the Spartans, so be it. They'll let it go, and they can go talk and spread whatever. They didn't care. I'm not saying that's wise. I'm just saying that's how Athens was. They employ the wealth more for use than for show. So they're looking at, rather than having just beautiful things that really please the richest amongst them, who have the time to go spend actually parading down a street or gathering at a temple in the middle of the day or whatever the case may be, rather than having a sudden parade that lasts momentarily. The first and foremost focus was making sure that basic needs were met. They had this money. They made sure that there was something for the poor to have, some work for them to do. Um, said there's nothing wrong with being impoverished. There's something wrong if you don't fight against it. Um, which I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with the whole sentiment, because it does seem to be a bit of accusing those who are still impoverished of not struggling against it. But it does fit together. The idea is you're looking to look for what's the best needs of the many, not just what might please the few, for that momentary uh, show of extravagance. They also say we regard the citizen who takes no part in these duties not as unambitious, but as useless. They really saw the group participation in this, um, in the democratic process, as having real utility. That there was something to be gained from seeing the perspectives of somebody else, of seeing all sides of the argument, of actually getting the input of everybody, not just a small portion thereof. It's not that oh, well, you just don't want to participate. Um, Go on your own way, bully for you because you're above the fray of politics. No, that was seen as something that they were withholding from the rest of society. They weren't doing their part in making these decisions. Um, However, the whole thing was not all roses and puppy dogs and all that fun stuff. They were um, less, definitely less than ideal in democracy at times, and very specifically, the freedom of speech was not as secure in Athens as it is here, um, as you'll soon find out. Let me adjust that. You can feel free to look up at 2 and 24, Book 2, Chapter 24. If anyone should move or put to the vote a proposition for using the money for any purpose whatever, except for defending, except that of defending the city, in the event of the enemy bringing a fleet to make an attack by sea, it should be a capital offense. That was the decision made by the bull in uh, by the no by the democratic body of Athens in the middle of the Peloponnesian War, that should you even argue for this particular money be spent in a different way, that they will actually kill you for it, which is one way or another a harsh penalty for speech. Um, it is not the norm, but it is, there. It was not held as absolutely sacred that you could say whatever you want. It was seen as so perverse and contrary to the group spirit of the democracy that they did not see that as protected, despite wanting all these different viewpoints. It was, of course, done right in the aftermath of an attack, of uh, right in the middle of a war. So there is some emotions there. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, but it does differ. You didn't have that strict right to say just whatever you want. If everybody just knew it was a dick thing to say, don't say that wildly crazy thing. If you do want to see the other speech, that is chapter 2, book 2, chapter 60 through 64. And you can see that there. I'm not going to read that off through here. Rather, we're going to go to our commercial break, just in case I have been monetized since you clicked on this link. And here we are. And some of you didn't see a commercial. We'll find out. But we're going to move on from Athens, and we're going to look at the other inspiration for American democracy, which would be the Roman Republic. Now, Rome is founded in 753 BCE, allegedly by Romulus, who had a famous brother named Remus. They fought. Romulus won. It had something to do with a wolf. I don't remember exactly why, but that's the mythology of Rome. Originally, kings were elected by the patricians. Now, patricians are the oligarchs or aristocrats of Roman society. So, from amongst themselves, they elected a king to rule, I assume, until death. I did not look into details there. Feel free to go look into more detail, but that's not important to the democracy part. 509 BCE. This is the same year that Isagoras attacked Athens to try to reinstate the oligarchy. The Romans had their own little semi-democratic revolution that year. The last Roman king is cast out of Rome, and the Senate is formed amongst the patricians. It is an oligarchy. It is not a democracy here. The city was also split into 30 curiae. Or is it curii? I'm going to say curiae, even though I know I'm not saying it the correct way. Interestingly, also using the number 30, which I don't think has any actual significance, just happenstance. But yeah, 30 curiae, and you have 30 tritii or something like that in Athens, both coming about basically in the same year. Though technically the Athenian thing started the year before. So, 494 BCE, the plebeian council is formed. This gives, the plebeians are your average, everyday Roman. They're not rich. They're not aristocrats, and the plebeian council has no real power. They may have created it as a way of just getting an idea of what was really going to piss them off, and they may have some civil unrest. They may have let them just, air out the ideas. Maybe it was, hey, you get some, you have a way to feel like you're doing something even though it has no real power. Maybe that was it. But the plebeian council, when it's formed here in 494 BCE, has no real power. They can't do anything. It's not even until 440 BCE, that's 54 years later, that the plebeians gain official legal equality with the patricians. That would be the same thing as isonomia. You have recourse to the courts, to the law, if you are mistreated. The plebeians did not have even that much to that point. And we're going to jump another 133 years forward, 287 BCE. It is at this point that the plebeians are granted the lex hortensia, which is a yes or no vote, or essentially veto power. Veto being Latin for I forbid. This is where you have tribunes, and they have, the plebeian council actually has some power, finally, of the plebeians in general. And how this came across, it's not something that just simply the patricians just gave to the plebeians, saying, oh, here, this, we need to move forward, we want progress. That is not how it works. Even with Athens, it was either to create stability so that they weren't all going to end up killing one another, and oligarchs losing power altogether, or it was an accident that the people got that kind of power because they were Cleisthenes possibly did not intend intend for them to have that power or expect it to be used very rarely, but they just casually usurped it. It says we can do this, we're going to do this, and it's like, oh, damn, you caught me. If I try to take it away now, you're going to kill us all. Which actually brings to another fun fact about Cleisthenes. Um, After that whole event, they just never talked about him again. So he may have just been complaining left and right about what was going on. As an example, we have no way of knowing one way or another what it was. But maybe that's why they didn't write about him. It's like, hey, he did this great thing. Oh, he's being a jackass about it. Nah, we're just not going to talk about him anymore. Put him aside. But now, how did the Romans get the Lex Hortensia? Well, the Romans, quite frankly, got the Lex Hortensia, at least according to popular myth, by all the plebeians banding together in an organized protest, leaving Rome, saying, hey, if you won't give us any say, fine, fuck you, we're leaving. You go play with yourselves. And because they couldn't operate without, these lower class workers to do most of the work for them, they said, okay, fine, we're going to give you this power, this veto power over what we do. You can't pass your own legislation, but you can tell us, no, we can't do this particular thing that we tried to pass. A lot of scholars say that never happened. They don't believe that it happened, but they're not thinking that it was just simply given. No, rather they think there was massive riots across Rome. So one way or another, something that you really see as a pattern in human society, people do not readily give up power if they don't have to. It has to be wrested from their hands. And that is what the plebeians, one way or another, whichever way it went, that's what they did in Rome. They took the power to be able to veto things at that point. And so you have, at that point, it's no longer a pure oligarchy, but it's not a pure democracy either. It's somewhere in between. And really, the Founding Fathers liked this balance. They didn't trust the Athenians, especially because Athenian imperialism got them into a whole lot of trouble, where they literally fucked up over and over and over again for that to happen. And actually, before the war was over, Athenian democracy had fallen, or at least for a few years, and then it came back in a second democracy until you finally had Alexander the Great take over. Now, moving on, 490, we have 107 BCE, you have the Marian Reforms. This allows plebeians into the army. So you have much of the same idea as Athens, where the average Roman was able to make some money off these state endeavors. They're able to be foot soldiers for Rome. It comes with pay. It comes with when you have these massive invasions, you have often slaves. Julius Caesar, after he conquered Gaul, famously gave slaves away to Gallic slaves that they captured, of course, but gave slaves away to his soldiers. He promised a whole bunch of them farmland for when they retired. And eventually, Augustus and Antony had to fulfill that and just stole the farmland from farmers rather than giving new lands. But the Marian reforms were a major part of making Rome seem more democratic. And this is not going to last very long. 91 to 87 BCE, slowly, it's not just Romans who get citizenship, but Italian allies are given Roman citizenship. So if you lived in Italy, which is below the Rubicon, and it's not including Sicily at this point. If you're on that peninsula, you're under Roman control, you become a Roman citizen. You have rights in Rome at that point. And this eventually does extend further and further, even after there's no semblance of democracy left in Rome. 81 BCE, Sulla becomes dictator of Rome. Much like tyrant, dictator does not necessarily mean what it means today. To be a dictator was something that was given temporarily. You had full power for a short period of time, then you had to count for yourself afterwards. It was just to deal with a specific issue. In 49 BCE, Gaius Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon with his army, starting a civil war. That was declaring war on Rome, essentially. You were not allowed to cross with your army into the cross that Rubicon into Italy. And 5 years later, 44 BCE, Caesar is assassinated. And it's important to note that Caesar very much was playing with the idea of being king. He didn't care about it necessarily being in name. He got more and more power. He was given the ridiculous dictator for life that he was able to force through. And everything is, he was very crafty, he was clever, both on the battlefield and politically. He was able to manipulate the situation. So the Roman senators gave him a temporary dictatorship, I think it was for 10 years. Hey, once this is up, he's going to, then we can deal with him. We'll be stronger then. He'll be weaker. His legions are going to be retired. Let's go. Let him play for right now. But he uses that power, gets new senators that he wants elected to the Senate, and those senators elect him dictator for life. He had played with having a crown in front of the people of Rome, and rejected it eventually twice. And his argument whether he was just trying to do it for show, or if he was trying to see, will they accept it? Do they love me enough that they'll accept me as a king? And of course, they didn't actually accept it. And I guess it was a diadem, not a crown per se. But 5 years later, he's assassinated by oligarchs, not by the people, by oligarchs. And we can jump ahead. Almost 20 years later, Octavian is named Augustus. He's made princeps of Rome, not king of Rome, princeps of Rome, and is essentially this is what we call the emperor. He's the prince of Rome. He gets called imperator, but that is a battlefield declaration. Your soldiers declare you imperator, and he had several cases where his soldiers did declare him imperator. But it didn't really have as much to do with empire, from my understanding. And so really we had Prince of Rome, not Emperor of Rome, for the period. But at that point, he is the Republic has fallen. The plebeian council loses all power to the Senate. Of course, the Senate doesn't really have any power. That belongs to the princeps. So Augustus has the ultimate power. He is controlling everything. That after him, his successors essentially control everything. Democracy is very shortly handled. Exists for a very short time within Rome and in a very limited fashion. And our forefathers tended to prefer this more than the Athenian version, in large part because who made the who essentially created the American democracy? It was men who were of the highest classes. George Washington was literally the richest guy in America. The you know the founding fathers owned large estates. They were educated. They were set to be um, essentially in charge with the king gone. And though they weren't landed nobility, they wanted that power, and so they much favored, as we'll get to later, they much favored a system that limited the power of your average person, the unruly mob, that they were absolutely fearful of. So before we leave, I'm going to leave you with 3 questions for you to consider. Feel free to discuss them in the comments below. Have a debate. Discuss them with friends. Discuss them with family. Get people to watch the video. First, is democracy important? Second, if so, what is important about it? Which features? What does it accomplish? Third, if not, why is democracy not important? What would be a better option and why? So it's fully open-ended. I'm not going to tell you here what you should or should not have. I definitely side on the side of having democracy, and my dissertation is going to go into a long diatribe explaining why that, amongst many different things, are all interconnected. But that's a few years away. Feel free to discuss. In the meantime, give a like, give a subscription, share this video on other social media if you found it useful. Next time we are going to go into the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. I was thinking of possibly going over Aristotle and Plato, but I've had so much frustration trying to get things to work. This backdrop did not work with my first attempts. I get ready to shoot, and then the whole thing would fall down on me. Finally, I got it hardwired into the wall, which is what I was hoping not to have to do, but I did have to do it. So I'm not going to have time to go into detail trying to read through those. I'm going to focus on things that I've already covered in depth because I want to get a few of these out to get everyone started before I start having any sort of significant break in between videos. But anyways, thank you for watching. Hope to see you again next time.